For decades, NATO was mostly seen in Europe as insurance, a political framework, or an American guarantee. Article 5 was something everyone knew about, but no one really imagined would ever be applied. Since the war in Ukraine, that era is over. Russia has reminded us of one simple thing. High-intensity warfare in Europe is no longer a thing of the past. It's a strategic possibility. And when a possibility becomes credible again, armies start training seriously once more. That's exactly what NATO came to do in Sweden, at the Kallax base in the north of the country, during the 2026 Ramstein flag exercise. I was there recently. I was able to film the aircraft, the crews, the infrastructure, but also a very practical exercise. The simulated crash of a Swedish helicopter in a wooded area, then the recovery of the pilot by Swedish Rangers aboard an NH-90. On paper, it looks like a pretty specific field scenario. In reality, it's a good summary of what NATO needs to learn to do today. Operate in a dangerous environment, coordinate multiple assets, recover its personnel, and keep acting, even if the adversary strikes first. So the central question is simple. How does Europe plan to protect itself from Russia? And the answer doesn't just lie in the number of planes, tanks, or missiles. It lies in the ability to make an entire system work. The war in Ukraine has forced Europeans to look at war again as it really is. A modern war doesn't necessarily start with a classic invasion, with armored vehicles crossing a border in front of cameras. It can start with strikes on air bases, drones, missiles, cyber attacks, electronic jamming, or sabotage operations against critical infrastructure. The goal is simple: prevent the enemy from responding. It's an approach that the Russians know very well. Striking depots, runways, command centers, the air defense system, it's an attempt to disorganize the enemy before the battle even really begins. For NATO, this requires adaptation. It's no longer enough to have good planes. You have to be able to get them off the ground, move them, refuel them, protect them, and coordinate them with radars, surface-to-air missiles, and command centers. It's less spectacular than a show of force, but it's much more important. An air force that can't protect its bases, can't share information, or depends on a few fixed facilities that are easy to target, becomes vulnerable. It's this vulnerability that NATO wants to reduce. In this video, we're talking about a simple idea. In the 21st century, power no longer relies only on planes, bases, or military alliances. It also depends on a less visible but decisive capability. Spread the risks, finance for the long term, and don't depend on a single point of vulnerability. And this logic also applies to your portfolio. That's why I'm reminding you about Maclear, the Swiss crowdfunding platform for peer-to-business lending. Basically, you are the one lending directly to European companies in the real economy, logistics, industry, commerce, and you receive a fixed income with monthly payments. The idea is not to replace your ETFs, your stocks, or your bonds, but to add another layer of diversification. What interests me here is mainly the risk structure. Maclear operates under Swiss regulation through Polyrig, a self-regulatory organization recognized by FINMA. Up to 90% of applications can be rejected. Each loan is backed by real collateral, and Maclear acts as the agent responsible for the collateral in the interest of investors. There is also a provision fund designed to cover certain temporary delays in interest payments. The minimum investment starts at €50 with no deposit, investment, or withdrawal fees. The displayed returns are around 14 to 14.5% per year, depending on the projects, with monthly payments. The platform's statistics are public. You can check the figures yourself with full transparency using the link in the description. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment, with 3% cashback for 90 days. Ramstein flag is not an air show. It's not a spectacle meant to show off beautiful takeoffs and some low passes for the cameras. It's a high-intensity military exercise. The goal is to test the alliance's ability to have several countries, different types of aircraft, multiple bases, various command centers, and several air defense systems work together. In 2026, Ramstein flag brought together up to 18 allied nations, more than 200 aircraft, and around 20 operational sites spread across several European countries. The exercise took place notably in Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, and Spain. This format says something very important. NATO is not training for a local war, limited to a single base or a single border. It is training for a broader European crisis. The core of the exercise is based on 4 ideas. First, integrated air defense. Specifically, this means connecting radars, aircraft, missiles, and command centers so that the Allies have the same view of the situation. Next, the fight against A2AD systems. Behind this acronym, there's a fairly simple idea: preventing the adversary from locking down an area with its missiles, radars, and air defense. The third concept is information sharing. In modern warfare, the one who sees first gains the advantage. Information must therefore circulate quickly between several countries, without waiting for each capital to go through the entire approval chain again. Finally, there is agile combat employment. Here too, the principle is simple. Do not concentrate all the aircraft in the same place. Disperse them, have them operate from multiple bases, use secondary runways, and reduce dependence on a few large, highly visible installations. This isn't theoretical. It's a direct response to the risks of a first strike. If a base is hit, operations must be able to continue elsewhere. If a radar is jammed, another sensor needs to take over. If a pilot is isolated, we must recover him. If the adversary believes they've paralyzed the system, we must show it's still working. That's the purpose of Ramstein flag. Sweden's entry into NATO doesn't just change the political organization of the alliance, it changes the map. For a long time, Sweden was close to NATO, but it wasn't a member. It cooperated with allies, took part in certain exercises, and shared many security interests with the West. But legally, it remained outside. Since March 2024, that's no longer the case. With Finland and Sweden in NATO, Northern Europe becomes more coherent militarily. Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, the Baltic states, and Poland now form a more integrated strategic group. For Russia, this changes several things. The Baltic Sea is becoming much harder to operate in. Kaliningrad remains an important Russian military position, but it is now surrounded by a much more NATO-oriented environment. The far north is also becoming more important. We're talking here about the Arctic, the Kola Peninsula, shipping routes, submarines, air bases, and access to the North Atlantic. This is not a marginal area. This is an area where Russia has significant military capabilities, and where NATO must be able to monitor, reinforce, and act. Sweden brings 3 things here. First, it brings geography. Its territory makes it possible to connect the Baltic, Scandinavia, and the far north. Next, it brings a military culture adapted to this environment. Cold, distance, forest, dispersed bases, difficult terrain. Finally, it brings a solid defense industry, especially in aeronautics with the Gripen, and more broadly, an ability to contribute to the defense of the northern flank. Kallax is therefore not just a base in the north of Sweden. It's a foothold in Europe's new defense. When you arrive at Kallax, you quickly realize that the exercise isn't limited to the planes visible on the runway. Of course, there are the aircraft, fighters, surveillance planes, support planes, but the most important part is behind the scenes. Communications, air traffic control, data fusion, coordination between units. That's what NATO is testing. One plane alone isn't enough. It needs to know where to go, who it's protecting, who is protecting them, what threats have been detected, which areas are off limits, what information is coming from the radars, and what decisions are coming from command. Modern aerial warfare works like a network. The pilot is an important link, but he's not the only one. Behind him, there are sensors, operators, controllers, refuelers, technicians, and rescue teams. And that's where the pilot recovery exercise really makes sense. While visiting Kallax, I filmed a revealing simulation. A Swedish helicopter supposedly crashed in a forest. A pilot needs to be recovered, and Swedish Rangers are deployed in an NH-90. The scene may seem limited, a few men, a helicopter, a forest, but from a military perspective, it's a complex operation. You have to locate the pilot, check for threats, coordinate the arrival of the helicopter, secure the area, extract the personnel, and you have to do all of this quickly. Because an isolated pilot can be captured, injured, or used by the enemy as a propaganda tool. In this kind of scenario, time is important, a military factor. The Rangers aren't there to put on a show. They represent a very real capability, retrieving isolated personnel in a hostile environment. The NH-90 is not just a means of transport. It becomes an extraction tool, but also a potential target. For it to be able to intervene, it has to be protected, guided, and given the right information. This requires coordinating several levels: the ground forces, the helicopter crew, the air command, allied aircraft, and surveillance assets. That's exactly what NATO wants to test, not an isolated action, but the ability of a system to respond quickly to an incident. This kind of exercise is important for a simple reason. In a real conflict, nothing happens cleanly. An aircraft can be hit, the weather can get worse, communication can be jammed, an area can become dangerous faster than expected. A mission that was initially simple can turn into a rescue operation. Serious armed forces don't just train for the ideal plan. They also train for what happens when the plan gets complicated. That's what this sequence in Calax shows. It gives a more concrete image of NATO. Not just an alliance of diplomatic summits, but a military structure that must be able to recover a pilot in a Swedish forest, under time constraints, in highly contested airspace. And this detail tells the bigger story: protecting Europe from Russia. It's not just about lining up more planes on a runway. It's making sure those planes can survive, operate, and be supported, and that their crews can be recovered if the mission goes wrong. So how does Europe plan to protect itself from Russia? The simplest answer would be to say, by rearming. And it's true, Europeans are increasing their defense budgets. They're buying ammunition, modernizing their air defenses, ordering planes, drones, radars, and anti-missile systems. But rearming is not enough. The real issue is the ability to turn these resources into a coherent system. An isolated surface-to-air missile doesn't protect much if it's not connected to a radar or a chain of command. A modern plane loses much of its value if the data doesn't arrive on time. An airbase becomes vulnerable if all the aircraft are concentrated there. A European army remains limited if each country operates with its own proposals, procedures, software, and its own political timelines. That's why NATO is increasing large-scale exercises. Ramstein flag is used to make sure the allies know how to work together before a crisis, not in the middle of one. The goal is clear: make Russian calculations harder. If Moscow knows hitting one base won't stop Allied aviation, deterrence is stronger. If Moscow knows that the Baltic and the High North are being monitored by several countries, all connected to each other, Russian freedom of action decreases. If Moscow sees the forces as connected, its freedom of action shrinks. If NATO can quickly disperse, coordinate, and reinforce, military action is riskier for Russia. Deterrence isn't just about threats. It's about convincing the adversary that the plan won't work. And that's exactly the message NATO wants to send. Ramstein Flag 2026 is therefore not just another air exercise. It's a signal. It shows that NATO is taking the scenario of a high-intensity war in Europe seriously. It shows that Sweden is now fully integrated into the defense of the continent. And it shows that Northern Europe is no longer a geographical margin, but one of the key areas of European security. Russia wanted to reduce NATO's influence at its borders. It got the opposite. Finland and Sweden joined the alliance, making the Baltic Sea harder for Moscow to maneuver and bringing the far north back into military focus. But make no mistake, NATO is not invulnerable. Europe still has significant gaps: ammunition stockpiles, air defense, drones, electronic warfare, logistics, industrial capacity. All of these remain a problem. But at Calax, we can see real progress. Europe is no longer just talking about defense. It is testing its procedures, integrating its new members, learning to operate in difficult conditions, preparing its bases, its networks, its crews, and its rescue units. And sometimes this transformation is best understood through a simple scene. A pilot isolated in a forest, an NH-90 arriving, Swedish Rangers securing the area, and behind them, an entire alliance that has to work. That's where European defense comes into play, not just in statements, but in the ability to act quickly together when the situation deteriorates. Welcome to the new military geography of Europe. Thank you for watching. The Terabellum adventure has lasted nearly 8 years, and it wouldn't be possible without you. There are still about 45 of you watching our videos without subscribing. Please know that it's free. And subscribing as well as liking helps YouTube promote these videos to a larger audience. It helps us tremendously to keep creating this content for you. Thank you. And see you next Sunday. Sue